Wow, okay, so the lights are up so bright that I can't see you, but I imagine you can see me, so I'm gonna jump right into it. My name is Trabian. I'm founding CEO of Be Me Community. Welcome, glad to have you here. Now, my talk is about the big picture, like the really big picture. In fact, my talk is about the frame that this picture is sitting in. When you think about our futures together, when you think about this country, there's a question that we have to answer if we're gonna plot our course properly. And it's very simply this: who do you think we are? Right? Not just who do you think African Americans are, but who do you think America is? When we think about our future together, we are entering a moment in American history that has never existed before. You are part of the last generation of America that will have a white majority. The future of America will be one where people of color, of all different backgrounds, all different persuasions, their voices are heard in a much different way than they could be in a society where everyone is majority white. But what have we done to prepare for such a future? When you think about all the systems in this country, when you think about all the assumptions in this country, when you think about any history book that I've ever read in school, they all sort of presume that the story is written for one person or one group of people. But that is not the America that our children will grow up in. In fact, the generation of Americans that is where the majority of the children are people of color, they're already in school right now, right? And so when you imagine our future together, you have to answer this question: who do you think we are? For the longest time in this country, the answer to that question plays out, it has played out, and still continues to play out on this racial totem pole, right? If you think about it, somewhere at the top of the totem pole is white men, and somewhere at the bottom of the totem pole are Native Americans or folk who've been incarcerated. And in the middle, Black folks and Latinos and dogs and cats are sort of just battling it out to see which ranking we get in this nation that is all of our nation, right? And when you think in particular about the Black men, this is the work that Be Me does. We look at Black men and we focus on their attributes that are about building community. We focus on their aspirations. We focus on their contributions. But when you think about Black men, it's important to ask yourself, well, who do you think we are? And let me illustrate what I mean by this. Many of the folk in Be Me will be familiar with this, but for those of you who haven't, I'm going to ask you some questions that I want your honest answer to. I'm going to have to squint to see you, but I want your honest answer. Just raise your hand if you've heard any of these statistics that say that across the country you have Black boys dropping out of school at like 50% rates in some places. You've ever heard a stat like that? All right. I should have called this next part of my talk, be honest, be fair, and be good to yourself, because we're gonna do all three of those things, but good. Now raise your hand if you've heard statistics that show that poverty among people of color is at this really high rate relative to the majority. If you've ever heard, get them up high. I see some people pretending like they don't know the answer to these questions, but you do, right? That's good. How about if you've heard stats on, unemployment, right? That unemployment in communities of color, of course, way higher than other communities. Now, if you can, I know it's a little dark in here, but if you can look around and see these hands, what is very clear is that we've all heard these stories. We're all familiar with this narrative. We have to tell the story of America. We have to tell the story of who we are. We could tell the story with this level of detail. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the dropout rate for the Black boys, you've heard that stat. Just raise your hands, and I'm going to ask the Be Me guys, don't do this. You know the answers. But for those of you who are familiar with the dropout rate, raise your hand if you know what percentage of Black young men are in college. If you know that statistic, just raise your hand. I don't see a lot of people know that statistic. Okay, well, what about if you look at the poverty rate? Raise your hand for those of you who have knowledge of how many Black millionaires there are in the United States. If you know that number, just throw your hands up for the millionaires because you're familiar with that stat. No? All right, we got a couple, good. For those of you who are familiar with the unemployment statistics, if you have some sense of, at what rate Black folks are creating businesses, could you raise your hand for that? Just anyone who, wow, not too many people, right? So the question then becomes, well, who do you think we are? If you can only tell the story but one way. When I asked you to paint the story of the destruction and the failure and the negatives, all of us are familiar with that narrative. But when I ask you to just tell the stories about the positives, the aspirations, the contributions, most of us are empty-handed in that narrative. And let's be clear, you're the good guys. I know that you care. You're here tonight because you care about building, but you can only tell the story but one way. Now, to get you breathing again, let me give you a slightly easier exercise. I want you to turn to someone in the aisle that's sitting next to you. Just turn to your neighbor. If you've been to church, turn to your neighbor. You know how this works. You've done this before. Okay. Turn to your neighbor. And what I'm going to ask you, I know it's dark in here, so you're going to have to lean in a little bit, but what I'm going to ask you to do is just for a moment, look at this person sitting next to you. And by the way, I can actually see you, so I want you to turn to your neighbor. It's okay. Turn to your neighbor. And all I want you to do is for 10 quick seconds, I want you to notice everything you can about the person that is looking at you. I want you to notice everything you can about what is wrong with this person looking back at you. Okay, all right. You can stop. Point made. Okay, you can stop. Look, I've asked a lot of people this question, and we always get the same response. People always laugh, right? But why do you laugh? Because you know that it's wrong and it's uncomfortable, and it's just natural for us to recognize that you don't look at someone and the very first thing you do is try to figure out what's wrong with them, right? But when it comes to our communities, when it comes to our cities, when it comes to our people of color, what is the first thing we do? Except to define them as under this and disadvantage that and at risk. Like we literally try to relate to them by the thing that is the most damning, the most humiliating, the thing that they're least proud of in their life. And look, everybody has problems. We're not saying don't recognize problems. But to define anyone by their problem is the definition of stigmatizing them. And all that we're saying is that if we're going to have the America that we want, the one that we can all value and believe in, we're going to have to come up with a way of recognizing each other's contributions and aspirations, not solely identifying people by their most damaging trait or something that stigmatizes them, right? I mean, put simply, if you had a friend, you probably wouldn't introduce your friend by saying, hi, this is my friend John. He used to wet the bed as a child and his mother was on welfare. That's not the way that we tend to introduce one to another. And by the way, if you have friends who do that, there are better friends out there, okay? So give yourself permission to try something different. Okay. But I wanted you to laugh a little bit about this, but the point that I'm trying to land, and it really does matter, it's what all the work in Be Me community is based on, is that by accident of history, we have an opportunity, if we so choose, to define ourselves in ways that dignify each and every one of us. And what I mean by that when I say by accident of history, the baby boomers, were the largest generation in the history of America for a long time. So everything about American personality, priorities, policies, all that stuff has been influenced by the baby boomer generation, which is great. But currently there's a generation that's even bigger than the baby boomers in numbers, right? The millennial generation, right? And they are not only bigger, they are the most diverse generation in the history of America. They're the most digitally connected generation in the history of America. And the fact of the matter is, on their watch, the narrative is going to change. The mainstream, the norms, the things that define this country are going to change. The question is, how are they going to change? Are they going to change in a way that recognizes and dignifies people, or are they going to change in a way that continues to denigrate and separate? We in the Be Me community believe that we can have an America that values all members of the human family, recognizes black males as assets, refuses to denigrate anyone, and works together to build a more caring and prosperous community. That is our mission, that is our purpose, that is what these men in the Be Me community do. I want you to get to know them. My name is Trabian Shoulders. Be who? Be me. All right, thank you.